When you boot up Donkey Kong Country, the first image you will see, after the company logos, is an elderly gorilla on red girders, turning the crank on an old phonograph that's playing the title music from the NES port of the original Donkey Kong. He's surrounded by blackness as far as the eye can see, isolated, forgotten. It's a somewhat somber, downbeat image, especially if on your first playthrough you're an excited 8-year-old mashing buttons to get to the game, and you miss how that cutscene continues. But that image tells a story, one that for me was incomplete, but evocative. "This is not your father's Donkey Kong," the manual exclaimed. At 8 years old, it was the perfect line to excite me about the revolutionary new game I was about to play. This promised to be cutting edge, not my father's Donkey Kong, but full-on 1994 newness. Play it loud! At the same time, even at such a tender age, I was a pedantic little cuss, so the thought of a then 13-year-old game being my father's Donkey Kong seemed kinda silly. Neither of my parents grew up playing video games, they were children of the 50s and 60s. The kids of the early 80s were probably just starting to have babies. But at the same time, it's a declaration that made a lot of sense. Today, 13 years marks a difference between now and Mario Kart Wii. It doesn't seem all that long ago. But in terms of video game development, 1981 to 1994 was a vast gulf. In 1981, arcades were king and the original Donkey Kong was considered cutting edge, with bright, colorful visuals that used animation to intimate the story of a man rescuing his girlfriend from a giant gorilla. Its gameplay pioneered running and jumping and climbing as video game staples. Its 4 single-screen stages were so complex that even its NES port 2 years later had to cut one of them out. But by the 1990s, the star of that game, no, not this guy, but this guy, had become the face of the industry and headlined massively popular games with dozens upon dozens of stages. And those were on home consoles. This was on a home console. This was on a home console. No wonder that old gorilla was looking so wistfully towards the past. The present had more or less passed him by. Donkey Kong had certainly passed me by. Oh sure, I occasionally rented Donkey Kong classics for my NES. I knew who Donkey Kong was, I'd played the game. But I was over here, taking one step from side to side, doing the Mario. And Mario had come a long way since 1981, developing a setting, a mythology, a cast of characters, revolutionizing gaming with each new title. Donkey Kong 3 had closed out the superlative Simian's main trilogy back in the early 80s, and, with the exception of an expanded Game Boy remake of the original, he'd pretty much languished unused since then, becoming the Garfunkel to Mario's Simon. I'm sorry, Art Garfunkel, I know you must be so incredibly tired of those kinds of jokes. Donkey Kong's fall from grace just happened to be right around the time I was born. So while my father had no Donkey Kong to speak of, there was a definite generational shift, one that I had missed out on. Because of the specifically weird timing of my entry into the world, I almost missed out on another generational shift, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I was born a good few months after the US launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System, but unbeknownst to us, when I finally received my own cherished NES on Christmas Day of 1989, we were less than 2 years away from the American launch of its successor. When that did happen, my mom scoffed at the idea of buying an expensive upgrade so soon after investing in the regular Nintendo, as we called it. The idea of video game consoles becoming obsolete seems pretty standard now, but back then it was like asking her to buy a new, betterer VCR that didn't play any of the tapes we already had. So for a while I could only witness the 90s console wars from afar. I dipped my toe into the Sega camp playing Sonic 2 and Golden Axe when I'd visit my cousins. I'd attempt to play Super Mario World whenever I'd visit a friend's house, but was completely flummoxed by how I was supposed to decipher this newfangled controller with 4 buttons. How was my thumb supposed to touch all of these? But for the most part, I was content with my NES and Game Boy. Then 1994 happened, and everyone was talking about Donkey Kong Country. I'd seen the promotional tape. My friend had rented the game from Blockbuster. The graphics looked nothing like I'd ever seen before. I'm not gonna lie, I was 8. I was just the right age to be taken in by the cool factor, to be blown away by those silicon graphics, to buy into the hype that this was not your father's Donkey Kong. And now that it was 5 years after 1989, my mom was finally ready to deign me with a Super Nintendo of my very own that Christmas. Or Santa was? And magically, the second I sat down to my own Super Mario World, that crazy controller made perfect sense. Not long after, probably for my 9th birthday, I received my own copy of Donkey Kong Country. By some magical aligning of the stars, Donkey Kong's revival was a leap to 16-bit gaming that perfectly coincided with my own. We'd missed each other the last time around, but Donkey Kong Country hit me like an 800-pound gorilla. And ever since, it's been one of my absolute favorite games. Welcome everyone to Donkey Kong Dissection. There's no tiptoeing around this. What this game was promoted for, and to a large degree what it's remembered for today, is its graphics. And those same attributes that made it such a hit in 1994 are also what age it today. While it's easy to poo-poo mid-90s CGI, it's important to understand why they made such a big splash at the time. Remember, this is an era when video game graphics and video game artwork could be somewhat incongruous, the famous NES black box aside. Pixel representations didn't look like hand-drawn artwork, and that artwork was intended to do the heavy lifting at getting across a game's premise and tone. In fact, that disconnect could be considered an advantage when certain franchises would make the leap to a different region. Capcom afraid this cartoony Rockman wouldn't sell in America? Just draw Mega Man to look completely different. Nobody's going to question the fact that the in-game sprite looks nothing like this monstrosity. We expected it. The idea was that the artwork was what the game was supposed to look like, if it could. Because no matter how good in-game graphics looked, they weren't going to completely match the official artwork on the box. This is what the box looked like, this is what the game looked like, this is what the manual looked like, this is what the game looked like. Even with the game packing a Super FX chip under the hood, this is the promo art, this is the game. But then you picked up Donkey Kong Country. This is what the box looked like. It's also what the game looked like. Yes, the graphics were heavily compressed and pixelated compared to the original models, but at 256 by 224 on a CRT, we couldn't tell that. For all intents and purposes, this was a game where what you saw on the cover was actually what you got. That was pretty revolutionary. I don't know why naughties were blue on the box, but yeah, whatever.
Am I gonna have to buy an adapter for my home Nintendo?
Not at all. In fact, when the game was created on the Challenge, it was basically specially output to the Super Nintendo game system.
While Sega was releasing pricey add-ons to beef up and prolong the life of their console, Donkey Kong Country blew them out of the water with just the base Super Nintendo console. It was something of a cheat. Nintendo games had for years made use of custom enhancement chips in their software to push past the limitations of the hardware. It's the reason why the same console that couldn't even perfectly duplicate Donkey Kong could later play host to comparatively complex games as Super Mario Bros. 3 or Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! But Donkey Kong Country didn't even take advantage of that. UK company Rare had instead invested in highly sophisticated silicon graphics workstations to create the 3D models and environments. It wasn't actually the Super Nintendo hardware or even onboard chip enhancements in the cartridge that were truly responsible for the graphical capabilities. It was making use of much more powerful outside hardware, the results of which were captured and then downgraded into a format the Super Nintendo could use. That's not to take away from the work Rare did. It's a creative application of technology, one that the upcoming 5th generation of games would get a ton of mileage out of. From the pre-rendered characters of Mario Kart 64, to the pre-rendered backgrounds and full-motion video that oozed out of every corner of the PlayStation Final Fantasy titles. And just how I was mesmerized by Donkey Kong Country at age 8, 14-year-old me would be blown away by Final Fantasy VIII's opening cinematic. It's not unfair to say the graphics were a huge selling point for me and for many other people. It's the whole reason Nintendo became a 49% shareholder in Rare and tasked them with resuscitating Donkey Kong. I will say that I think the graphics hold up. Good art design is good art design. There's a reason Nintendo is still using Rare's Donkey Kong model as a basis for their own to this day, nearly 2 decades after the company was bought by Microsoft. I mean, that's now twice as long as the lifespan of the original Donkey Kong model. These character models possess such detail and animation, so expressive and alive. The environments are incredibly gorgeous and varied, from its jungles to its ice caves to its factories. It almost makes me wish the game could be remade with the original CG renders at their full resolution and color, just to really take in how beautiful they are. If the images in the manual are any indication, it would look amazing. Sure, 1990 CG is incredibly outdated at this point, and a modern console could run circles around this, but Rare made it work for them. Somehow those rubbery textures work for palm fronds. They couldn't quite make textured hair for the Kongs, but the more abstract hair design doesn't clash with the cartoony aesthetic of the characters. However, that graphical advantage has always been a double-edged sword. The big sticking point you'll often hear from critics is that the game coasted on nothing but graphics. It used its compelling assortment of computers to razzle-dazzle people into overlooking a fairly average platformer. I think there's some degree of truth to that. The graphics were such a draw that I think they would have been enough to sell the game regardless, but I believe that's selling Donkey Kong Country short. The magic of the game is not simply in its graphics, it has such a charm and character. Rare had to overcome huge hurdles in reviving Donkey Kong, and I think it's often taken for granted just how much of Donkey Kong's current image and identity they shaped.
Basically, we had a chance to kind of create a new story for Donkey Kong.
If you haven't seen the videos the Geek critique has done on the Donkey Kong series, I highly recommend you do so, although preferably after you finish watching this one. I gotta eat too, you know. But in his video for Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, he posits that Donkey Kong's problem in the 21st century was that, while he possessed a high degree of brand recognition, he lacked brand identity. While I agree, I think that's even truer when talking about Donkey Kong before Rare got their British mitts into him. Again, by this point, Mario had become a fully fleshed out character that made Jumpman look positively primitive. He'd gone through his growing pains, but what even was Donkey Kong? What was his setting? What was his goal? What did he do? What kind of game should he even be in? In his primary titles, Donkey Kong had never been the subject of a video game, he'd always been the object. You defeat Donkey Kong, you rescue Donkey Kong, you shove a can of bug spray up his butt. Donkey Kong was an eye-catching, detailed sprite, but he was far too big to be a player character. It's crazy to think about the fact that getting to play as Donkey Kong in a Donkey Kong game was still a novelty by 1994. Even when Nintendo got the whole Mario extended family together to race go-karts, it was the comparatively smaller Donkey Kong Jr., the second game's protagonist, who was given a spot in the roster. How do you craft a revival of Donkey Kong when Donkey Kong barely has any consistent thematic elements codified in the first place? What do you revive? Mario? No, he's off doing his own thing. Pauline? No, if there was any one character in 1994 more underutilized than Donkey Kong himself, it was Pauline. But don't worry, she'll make a comeback eventually. So much of the Donkey Kong mythos had to be constructed from scratch. Donkey Kong Island, the Banana Horde, the extended Kong family, the Kremlings. None of those concepts can be credited to Nintendo's Donkey Kong, but to Rare's. The Kremlings were such a departure they didn't even originally have anything to do with Donkey Kong. They were created as villains for an unreleased Rare point-and-click adventure, Johnny Blastoff and the Kremling Armada. Redesigned from a collection of militaristic space pirates, the dopey but dangerous reptiles make off with Donkey Kong's coveted banana horde and set the adventure into motion. That said, I have a hard time believing that at least one Kremling, the diminutive snap-jawed Claptrap, didn't at least pull some inspiration from the, well, Snapjaw enemy from Donkey Kong Jr. And believe it or not, I wrote Snapjawed as a description before I looked up what the name of that enemy was. I am so cool. Diddy Kong, the secondary player character, was originally supposed to be an updated Donkey Kong Jr. It certainly makes sense to put him as Donkey Kong's sidekick. However, Nintendo objected to the extensive redesign that basically transformed him from an ape into a monkey, so Rare rechristened him as a brand new character. And it's that commitment to the integrity of their IPs that has ensured that Donkey Kong Jr. continues to be a popular and widely used character to this day. It was probably for the best. Donkey Kong was already such a mouthful that the updated version tends to be referred to simply as DK. We really didn't need two characters with the same name, especially given that lack of identity problem. Perhaps the most interesting addition to Donkey Kong Country's storyline comes in the form of Cranky Kong and the metatextual flavor he adds. Given Nintendo's objection to not Donkey Kong Jr., I'm amazed they let Rare get away with this one. Donkey Kong Country reveals that its playable DK isn't even the same character from the arcade games. His grandfather, Cranky Kong, is. He got one last swan song in the Game Boy remake earlier that year before growing really old, changing his name, and retiring from video games. As disappointing as it is that this revival once again pushes the titular primate to non-playable status, it's an intriguing premise. For one, it acknowledges that time has passed, that the Donkey Kong license languished for so long, requiring a revival in the first place. These characters aren't frozen in time, but have grown and evolved. This really isn't my father's Donkey Kong. But remember what I just said. I didn't say that Cranky had retired from kidnapping women or vandalizing greenhouses. I said he had retired from video games. Despite moving the action to a more naturalistic setting, the whole conceit of the character is that he knows he was a video game star, and he's not afraid to regale anyone within earshot that he was. All the characters know they're in a video game. Diddy Kong aspires to be as big a star as Donkey Kong himself. Frankly, I don't even know what he's looking up to. This is this Donkey Kong's first game. What has he done that's so impressive? This shattering of the fourth wall is certainly not an aspect of video game storytelling anyone had ever seen with Mario or Zelda, and Donkey Kong Country's winking towards the TV screen contributes a huge part of the charm. But Cranky's keeping of the legacy served another purpose. I think it's fair to say that Rare knew that their game would be accused of coasting on its impressive visuals, and that, I dare say, is why Rare created Cranky Kong, to combat any such accusations. Because Cranky's more than willing to make those accusations himself. That's why he's cranky. He thinks video games have gone downhill. They're too complicated and overly reliant on fancy graphics. Back in his day, games knew how to be games! And if he has to set up a cabin in every world just so he can sit outside of it in his rocking chair and make sure you know that, then he will. And it's brilliant! It cuts all the critics off at their knees when the game is making fun of itself. I don't really believe that Earthbound's This Game Stinks marketing campaign managed to sink it, when self-deprecating digs serve as the pillars of DKC's personality. Seriously, if you've played this game but never read through the instruction manual, you are doing yourself a disservice and haven't really experienced all this game has to offer. It is hilarious! I used to take these manuals to school with me and read them in class, and no, Cranky, not just because I was bored. It's one thing to have Cranky belittle your characters while you're playing the game, but it's even better to have Cranky insult you for playing it. With a new setting, new villains, new characters, and even a new Donkey Kong, about the only element Rare incorporated from the old games was, well, these flaming oil drums show up in a couple of levels. Oh, also barrels. Yep, the original Donkey Kong threw barrels as obstacles in the very first level of the very first game. Apparently, they weren't simply convenient projectiles lying around the construction site, because these Kongs have built their entire civilization around barrels. Star barrels record your progress, steel kegs can be ridden on top of, barrels turn on lights, barrels stop rock lizard men from running around, airplane barrels shuttle you from world to world. Even the bad guys get in on it, sealing up your injured partner in a conveniently labeled DK barrel. And of course, barrels serve as the same rolling weapons of destruction they did for the original Donkey Kong, except that finally, you're the one throwing them. Most of the time. That, at last, brings me to the gameplay itself. Yeah, I know, I've spent most of my time up until now discussing creation, story, character. That's kind of what I do, what I'm used to talking about, and the types of media I typically review. But this is a video game, it's all about the gameplay. Talking about its charm is all well and good, but it doesn't do much to defend against those accusations of the game being overhyped. So how does it play? Well, Donkey Kong was one of the pioneers of platforming as a genre, a legacy that Mario ran, jumped, swam, and flew with when he spun off into his own series and became its biggest champion. It shouldn't be much of a surprise that Donkey Kong continues along that same mold. I don't feel that's a problem. If you're gonna crib from someone, why not the best? But I still think Donkey Kong Country does plenty that makes it stand out from Mario. Balloons serve the role of one-up mushrooms. Bananas have taken the place of coins. Collect 100 to earn an extra life. They often give hints towards locations of bonus rooms or how to safely navigate platforming challenges. But bananas do function in a narrative capacity too, as they're said to be bananas from DK's hoard that the Kremlings have dropped. Rather than existing for no real purpose, they are literally guiding you. Yeah, I know, I'm doing story again. Hey, it happens, I have an addiction. Borrowing from a less well-known Mario trope, Donkey Kong Country's character system hews closely to both versions of Super Mario Bros. 2, in that each of your player characters has his own strengths and weaknesses. DK is strong. He hefts barrels over his head and can take out certain enemies that Diddy either struggles with or can't manage at all. Diddy, however, is faster, a smaller target, and while the instruction manual acts as if DK's barrel-holding style is a sign of that character's strength, the fact that Diddy can't means he holds barrels in front of him, which is much more useful for warding off oncoming enemies and opening up bonus rooms. In fact, Diddy's advantages for platforming are so numerous that I often hear speedrunners opine, if you're Donkey, you're dead. There are no health restoratives for the Kongs. It's the paradigm of simplicity. One hit and that Kong is out. But if you have the other in tow, he'll take over without losing a life. In essence, your Kong buddy serves as a substitute for a life bar. Keeping both members and learning when to use which character is essential to succeeding. However, beyond those token differences, which are advantageous if utilized well, there's nothing keeping a player from beating a stage or the game with either Kong. And while perhaps that mechanic could go deeper, it works fine as it is. Like the American Super Mario Bros. 2, there may be stages that are easier with a certain character, but your choices are primarily dictated by your own personal taste. Just as important as those individual differences is a skill that both Kongs share that 2D Mario doesn't have: rolling. Well, strictly speaking, Diddy has a cartwheel, but they both do the same thing. The roll serves as a frontal attack, which is certainly useful. The weaker Diddy, for instance, can't take out the helmeted clump with a jump attack, but he can bowl through a line of their fleshy stomachs with a cartwheel. Better still, the roll mechanic contributes to the game's sense of speed, forging its identity well away from Mario. Watching someone play Donkey Kong Country without rolling makes the game look like a stiff, plodding affair, especially as the slower DK. The roll provides a quick burst of speed, but it's so much more than that. Leaping out of a roll carries its momentum, providing greater distance for jumps. You can even leap out of a roll in midair, leading to collectibles placed within pits that require death-defying leaps and precision placement to grab while saving your own skin. Finally, rolling through an enemy extends the length and speed of a roll, and there are sections with strategically placed lines of enemies designed to amp up your speed if you let it happen. It's all part of the design philosophy that allows a skilled player to blow through levels at greater and greater speed. Another mechanic lifted from the Mario playbook is its use of rideable animal buddies. Mario had Yoshi to provide an extra hit and make quick work of enemies. Donkey Kong Country naturally feels compelled to up the ante with far more variety, featuring 4 distinct rideable animals. I'm not really sure who keeps putting them in crates, and like Yoshi, it tends to be ambiguous whether each of these is an individual character or a species. Rambi the Rhinoceros definitely serves as the de facto face of these guys. He appears on the box art and in the first level, and he is one of the first indicators of that far more kinetic than Mario playstyle. He can charge through almost everything, enemies go down with ease, and he can break open secret passageways. On Guard the Swordfish is largely Rambi's analog underwater. He can move more easily and more quickly than the Kongs can swim, and his needle nose can thrust forward with a tap of Y, taking out enemies just like Rambi's charge. However, since On Guard is engaging enemies on both the horizontal and vertical axes, it's all too easy to take a hit when you think you should be delivering one. Winky the Frog is the premier jumper and can still take out the kind of armored and spiked enemies that Rambi can, as long as the death blow is from above. Espresso the Ostrich is the speedster, going faster than any character and possessing the ability to hover in midair by flapping his wings. But he has no combat aptitude and is more or less defenseless. He takes damage if he lands on an enemy, and while small enemies are supposed to walk between his spindly legs without causing damage, more often than not, they still do. I hate to say it, but Espresso's the weak link of the animal buddies, and he's usually not worth the struggle of keeping him alive. It's usually only necessary if he's required to reach a bonus area, and as such, he often feels like more of an escort mission than a power-up. Finally, there's Squawks the Parrot, who serves a support role rather than as a rideable mount. He appears in exactly 1 level to hold a flashlight. Yeah, that's about it. Not much to say about this guy. For now. Animal buddies help provide diversity to the gameplay, but they're a secondary aspect and only show up in levels on occasion. What's really important is the basic level design. Again, Donkey Kong Country doesn't make use of the same advanced chips that other late-era SNES games do. The backgrounds are pre-rendered and static. You're not going to see any of the kinds of scaling and rotating environmental hazards that would be shown off in, say, Yoshi's Island. Donkey Kong Country is well known for its stage gimmicks, although I think that can be a bit of a loaded term. Perhaps it should be considered theming rather than gimmicks. Most of its alliteratively named levels have a distinct set of mechanics that set it apart from others. The challenge is introduced, simply at first, and then each iteration builds upon it, making it gradually more difficult, sometimes within a stage and other times from stage to stage. For example, you'll have a slow-moving, tracked platform to ride on. The first half has you following the track and avoiding enemy fire. In the second half, you must contend with enemies falling from above and sharing the cramped space with you. In a later level, a similar platform has to constantly be maintained with fuel, or else you'll fall to your death. There's a level with intermittent lighting. There's a level where the lights have to be manually turned on every few seconds. One level has elevators to navigate, becoming increasingly difficult to get from one to the next. 2 levels have you fleeing from a series of unstoppable enemies. Another 2 have you careening through broken tracks in a minecart. Those are perhaps my favorite, with their breakneck speed and pinpoint timing. If not them, then certainly the barrel cannon sections are the most hectic and kinetic. See, the wildest, most ridiculous application of barrels in the game is the one I haven't even mentioned yet. Some barrels have open tops and simply float in midair, waiting to be jumped into. They act as cannons that launch you to other areas or from barrel to barrel in sprawling sequences requiring lightning-fast reflexes to not miss the next barrel and fall to your death. You manually fire regular barrel cannons, but barrel cannons with explosions painted on the side are auto blast cannons that shoot you out immediately upon entering. These are the sections I say are most comparable to the speed and excitement that Sonic the Hedgehog was riling gamers up with over on Sega's side. Barrel cannon sections start out fairly tame, usually only rotating in a small number of set increments or traveling in a straight line. By later worlds, they become much more complex, like Treetop Town, with its auto blasts in the middle of a sequence that force you to plan moves out in advance. It all culminates in the first level of World 4, Snow Barrel Blast, which contains 360-degree rotating barrels at high speeds, enemies to dodge, and a blizzard rendering everything difficult to see. Donkey Kong Country doesn't have the sheer number of levels as its mustachioed contemporaries, but sections like these prove DKC can be insanely challenging in its own right. Tying into the difficulty is the sporadic nature of save points. The game does rather railroad you. There is one candy save point in each world administrated by Gorilla Pinup Candy Kong. Once you reach it, you can use it as many times as you'd like, but sometimes getting to it is the real trick. Once you enter a new world, you're stuck in it. You can only return to a previous world and its previous save point through Funky's Flights, the airplane barrel shop run by surfer dude Funky Kong. But just like with the save point, that's something you can't do until you reach his area on your current map. Until one of those points is reached, you are forced to make your way through whatever number of levels stand in your way without a safety net. If you get a game over, it's all the way back to whatever your last save was. And every time you restart the game, any extra lives you've built up in the earlier easy levels are gone, setting you back to 5. Frustrating, but that's just the way it was back then. World 4 Gorilla Glacier is where the game really hits you over the head with this. Both Candy and Funky are located in the back half of the world, and the front half contains some pretty challenging courses, including the aforementioned Snow Barrel Blast and its Cannon Gauntlet. I can't tell you how many lives that level alone ate through when I was a kid. Hopefully you learned at some point not to blithely walk into the next world after beating a boss, but instead turn right back around to the world you just finished and its warm, inviting save point to at least minimize the damage of a game over. I've never been particularly hostile towards games that don't let you save whenever you want. I grew up with an NES where having the ability to save at all was a luxury. Oh geez, now I'm starting to sound like Cranky Kong. Of course, by now I've played these games enough times that I can blaze through all of Donkey Kong Country in a quick afternoon and never worry about getting a game over. But I do appreciate the challenge. There is something to be said for being able to gain the skills necessary to beat several hard levels in succession, rather than simply managing to get lucky with one at a time and never having to look back. Well, let me clarify. I don't think one is necessarily better or worse than the other as long as a game is balanced well enough to its saving system. But I am disappointed that such gauntlets have fallen by the wayside. I can tell you that stretch of Gorilla Glacier was a real nail-biter the first time I played it, and the relief and accomplishment I felt when I finally reached that save point is definitely something you just don't experience when you have the safety net of being able to save after every level. At 9 years old, I really had to test my mettle here. I was finally growing old enough to get good at video games, which was fortunate because I never had a Game Genie for Super Nintendo. You can bet Game Genie was attached to every game I inserted into my NES though. It was the only way I could beat the Marios as a little kid, but no more. I had to master Super Nintendo games, and Donkey Kong Country put me through my paces. Every time I struggled through one stage, a new mechanic came into play that forced me to learn something else, ramping up difficulty the further I progressed. And when that game over screen did rear its ugly head, I had to remember the skills I gained from those levels I was about to redo. That's what got me good enough to get through the game in just over an hour. And aside from some unpleasantness with Espresso's spindly legs, all the challenge felt fair. It was infuriating, but fair. This wasn't the kind of difficulty that existed just to pad out a game, or followed in the tradition of arcade classics desiring to vacuum quarters out of kids' pockets. The game gives you the tools and knowledge to succeed, and the only thing holding you back is your own skill. And that is the most rewarding a game can be. Once you boot up Donkey Kong Country and move past that wistful old ape and his phonograph, you'll notice something else that makes the game stand out. It tracks your playtime and completion percentage. I had yet to play an RPG, so this was certainly the first time I remember a game tracking how long I'd been playing it. But the fact that it told you how much of the game you'd played still seemed like quite a novelty as well. Even after you clear every stage, defeat King K. Rool, and reclaim the Banana Horde, you'll see that your completion percentage is nowhere near maxed out. Even Cranky chastises you for not finding everything. In order to achieve full 101% completion, because apparently Rare believes you can complete more game than there is game, you have to do a little more than just beat it. This is perhaps the only time that Donkey Kong takes the wrong lesson from Mario. Back in the NES days, most games didn't care how you beat them. Their arcade forebears, like Donkey Kong, were all about racking up a high score, so a lot of early games didn't even have true endings. But whether you played all 32 levels of Super Mario Bros. Or warped your way to World 8, the game still rewarded you exactly the same. In fact, since most games had to be beaten in one sitting, warps were a way of circumventing having to play every level every time you booted up. But once battery-backed memory became a thing and allowed you to continue from where you left off, games could be more complex, be designed in a way to be savored and explored, rather than run and done before mom called you for dinner. Super Mario World contained multiple exits for most of its stages. Those exits opened up more of the game world. Scouring the levels to completion gave you access to alternate routes and more challenging stages you wouldn't otherwise see if you were simply taking the linear path everywhere. In essence, diligent searching provided more game, a tangible reward for your hard work. The game kept track of these things you've done and would proudly announce to you how many exits you'd found every time you opened your saved game. Donkey Kong Country picked up on this more exploratory shift and followed suit. The problem is, rather than tying this exploration reward into new content, Donkey Kong Country tethered it to bonus rooms. Breakaway walls and just barely off-screen barrel cannons led players to small mini-games where they could pick up bananas and extra lives. Now, I hear a lot of people complain that there's not enough variety, but I don't think that's a problem. In fact, I like most of them. They're fun diversions with useful rewards, but they're just that. Bonuses. They give you more lives, which can be good if you're trying to stave off that World 4 game over. Bonus rooms have always been a part of the Mario formula, but not even Mario World kept track of whether or not you found them. Super Mario World also had Dragon Coins. There were typically 5 of them in every level, and if you collected all 5, you'd get an extra life. The game didn't keep track of this or reward you for them, at least not in the original version. That wasn't the point. They were collectibles, but not completionist collectibles. They simply helped you if you were studious enough at finding them. And if you didn't, it didn't make a difference. Their analog in Donkey Kong Country are the Kong letters. In every stage, there are 4 tokens that spell out the word Kong. If you collect them all, extra life. They don't count towards your completion, nor should they. The reward is the extra life, and if you don't need an extra life, there's no point in being penalized. DKC, however, requires you to find every single bonus room in the game in order to achieve full completion. But these bonus rooms aren't all that different from Mario's bonus rooms. Some of them provide a skill-based challenge, but for many others it's just collect the goodies until you're tired of collecting them and leave. In those cases, there's not any way to quote-unquote win. The game doesn't even care whether you lose or collect a single banana. You can literally enter every bonus room, immediately take a death, and you still get the same credit you would if you aced every challenge. The game won't even let you re-enter a bonus room without exiting the entire level. I'm sure that's to keep you from flagrantly farming for lives, but that just shows how out of step the completionist requirements are with the content provided. Actually doing things isn't important, finding things is what matters. To my personal taste, I prefer challenges that test my ability to do things rather than test my patience to find things. In the main quest of Donkey Kong Country, succeeding at increasingly challenging and complex platforming is the name of the game. And to be fair, there are many bonus rooms in this game that test my mettle in a way that simply getting to them is rewarding in and of itself. Take the beginning of Platform Perils. Right from the beginning you can see a blast barrel in plain sight. You know exactly where it is, but getting below the catwalk you're on is another matter. It took me years to figure out there's a hidden platform that takes you there. Or how about this? As I've mentioned, following trails of bananas can often lead to bonuses. Learning to think laterally within that pattern pays off in Minecart Madness, where you have to notice the trail you're following suddenly breaks in the middle, and the lack of bananas is your clue that there's a bonus barrel just off screen. Even in Ice Age Alley, where I complained about Espresso being an infuriating escort mission to reach bonuses, my skill is being challenged. But when the game expects me to jump into every open pit and hope for the best, I'm no longer having fun. And while it's polite enough to add an exclamation point at the end of a level's name to let you know you found everything, some of these bonus rooms are ridiculously cryptic. For example, most levels tend to have 2 to 3 bonus rooms. For some ungodly reason, Orangutan Gang has 5. It's the only stage in the game to pack that many in. Some require leaps of faith, and one combines that with requiring you to backtrack all the way to the beginning of the level with Espresso. There is nothing intuitive about that, nothing in any other part of the game that would train you to try that, and it completely breaks up the flow of the level. While the overall enjoyment of Oil Drum Alley isn't ruined in quite the same way, it does win the dubious distinction of containing the most obtuse bonus room ever. There's a bonus room you enter with a 3-barrel slot machine game. That's a fairly common bonus. You jump up to stop on the currently flashing item. With good timing, you match all 3, you win the prize. Somehow, and I have no idea how, you're supposed to know that in this particular bonus, you should be aiming for the smallest prize, which in itself is unintuitive. That's because, in this case, and no other case, matching up the single banana does not give you a banana, but a barrel. That's because you're supposed to use that barrel to bust open a wall in the bonus room you're already in to access another bonus room. This is World 5. Nothing like this has ever happened before. There is no other point in the game where there's a bonus room hidden within another bonus room. The only hint you get is an arrow pointing to the right, which doesn't really tell you a lot because those signs are all over the factory levels, and the majority of bonus rooms have exits on the right side of the room, whether or not your characters can actually use them. As if it wasn't ridiculous enough, let's say you do all that. For some reason, you decide to go for the single banana instead of any other prize. To your astonishment, you get a barrel. You notice the arrows pointing to the right, and you put 2 and 2 together. You throw the barrel at the wall. The bonus game immediately ends and ejects you back to the level. You're confused because you clearly saw a wall break. So now you have to exit the level because, as I've said, you can't tackle a bonus room more than once during a single play. So you do that, get the barrel again, and this time you decide to walk into the wall while holding the barrel. The bonus game immediately ends and ejects you back to the level. Because this situation is so completely unique, the game doesn't even know how to process it. It is instead programmed to end the second the barrel is broken. That means you have to trigger your exit from the room at the same moment you break open the room, which requires you to perform a running jump into the wall. So not only do you have to know that this bonus room houses another bonus room, not only do you have to know to not even try for the big prize, not only do you have to know that the prize you see is not the prize you get, you also have to realize that you have to literally trick the game into letting you into the bonus. Chances are you'll never even know you're supposed to be looking for anything out of the ordinary here and drive yourself crazy wondering why you can never get that exclamation point in Oil Drum Alley. After you've completed every other ridiculous exercise and jumping off cliffs, you'll still find yourself one bonus room short of fully completing this game. But even if you find every single bonus room, your grand reward for all of your effort is a different bit of dialogue from Cranky Kong. How wonderful. It is not worth going for 101% completion in Donkey Kong Country. You're better off just finding what you can and letting yourself get lost in the gameplay. The bonus rooms themselves are fun enough to play, and some of them are rewarding to find. But there are enough that are so infuriatingly unintuitive that they actually manage to break up the kinetic flow. That tightly constructed, fast-paced gameplay is so core to the enjoyment of the experience that it baffles me why Rare would shoot themselves in the foot like that. You may wonder why I would spend so much time talking about something that is so relatively minor and not even required. That's because the Donkey Kong games as a whole have a deep investment in bonus content that becomes more and more pronounced as the series progresses. It is necessary to see the seeds of it here. Some future titles will learn from these mistakes and craft a much better balance between the main game and the bonus rewards. Then again, we will eventually get to a point where cryptic accumulation of trinkets becomes the entire game. And I think it's only fair to lay some of the blame here at the beginning. Well, I'd hate to leave things on a negative note, so music. I mean, what else is there to say? You've been listening to it this whole time. The soundtrack, composed by David Wise, Evelyn Fisher-Novakovic, and Robin Beanland, is excellent. It's the first video game soundtrack I remember seeing having its own album promoted.
Because the music is so good, we're putting this music on a CD. Hasn't been a big hit in America because maybe the music hasn't been quite up.
There's an atmosphere here that I hadn't really heard in video games before. I've certainly always loved me some chiptunes, but most game music I'd heard prior to this were all about catchy melodies, which is great. This game certainly delivers on that front too, but I'd never heard video game music try to be so evocative. It's not all bouncy, happy, pulse-pounding. It can be contemplative and melancholy, creating a nice contrast to the action of the game. Many people point to Aquatic Ambience for its beautiful, relaxing capabilities, and that is certainly an amazing track deserving of all of its accolades. But I think it's Northern Hemispheres that stands out most to me. Many of the tracks feature a slow, quiet build, including the classic Island Swing, but there's just something about this almost despairing piece as the snow continues to fall harder and harder, pushing to a wailing crescendo right as you struggle through that barrel gauntlet, that makes it my favorite. I think what really works in regards to the music in the Donkey Kong Country games is that you could completely divorce it from its content and it would still work. You wouldn't play this soundtrack and necessarily think, oh, this is music for a game about a cartoon gorilla beating up reptiles who stole his bananas. That's not to say it's ashamed of its material or veers too far off tone. Rather, it creates a sense of balance, taking itself seriously enough that it doesn't allow the premise to veer off into feeling too saccharine or cutesy. The characters, environments, and music all meet precisely in the middle in a way that allows the cuddly, the goofy, the raucous, and the somber to intermingle without feeling jarring. And I think that describes the overall strength of Donkey Kong Country as a game. While it is certainly buoyed up by its exciting graphics and gripping musical score, they work in concert with strong gameplay that might be simpler and shorter than some of its AAA contemporaries, but is nonetheless addictive and tons of fun to master. It's a complete departure from the Donkey Kong games of old, while still feeling rooted in its principles. Dusting off that classic license like the graphics helped pull people in, but this was its own experience, a new frontier unlike any prior Donkey Kong game. Rare truly did take a nearly forgotten property and make it their own. Revive it, breathe new life into it, crafting a legacy that carries through to this day. Like they said, this wasn't my father's Donkey Kong, but it did become my Donkey Kong. Thanks so much for watching. Thank you in particular to Krimson KB for providing this beautiful Super Famicom-styled analog Super NT for me to capture footage of this game. Be sure to check him out, both here on YouTube and on Twitch, for game reactions and nightly game streaming. Please let me know what you think. This was my first time doing a real scripted video game review. It was way out of my comfort zone, and it took me over a year on and off in between my other videos to get it done. So a huge, huge thank you to my patrons for making it even remotely possible for me to tackle a project like this in the background. If you liked this video, I will certainly continue with the future Donkey Kong installments. In the meantime, you might like some of my other work, like my ongoing Dragon Ball review and analysis series, Dragon Ball Dissection, as well as my Sentai to Power Rangers comparison series, Mighty Morphin Zyurangers. I hope to see you in the future. Have a great day!